On April 4th, 2011, a series of troubling events unfolded in Texas, beginning with Robert Frisbee's arrival at the local police station. Deeply distressed, Robert reported his 17-year-old daughter, Bridget, as missing. Despite believing she had spent the previous night at a friend's house, his concerns grew when she failed to return home and remained unreachable by phone. His worry escalated to alarm, prompting him to seek help from the authorities. Bridget Frisbee's story began on December 17, 1993, when she was born. Her early years are shrouded in mystery, having spent her infancy in an orphanage until she was adopted by Catherine Randall Frisbee and Robert Frisbee at 18 months old. Robert and Catherine, who would always be referred to as her father and mother, welcomed her into a loving home. As Bridget grew, she blossomed into a cheerful, energetic, and curious girl with a deep love for poetry, painting, and horseback riding. However, her life was shadowed by persistent difficulties from birth. When she was just 6 years old, her mother, Catherine, succumbed to a prolonged illness, passing away at the age of 49. This loss was devastating for both Bridget and Robert, leaving a void in their lives that was difficult to fill. Robert, determined to provide a happy life for his daughter, strove to create a warm and trusting relationship with her. Despite his best efforts, Bridget's rebellious nature often surfaced as she approached her teenage years, adding complexity to their bond. This period of their lives was marked by a blend of affection, challenges, and a shared grief that drew them closer, yet sometimes pushed them apart. On the afternoon of April 3, 2011, a group of teenagers ventured into a wooded area near their small Texas town, seeking a secluded spot to enjoy the warm spring day. As they wandered deeper into the forest, their carefree exploration took a grim turn. One of the teens stumbled upon the lifeless body of a young woman partially hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves and underbrush. Panic set in, and they hurriedly called the police. Responding quickly, the local authorities cordoned off the area and began their investigation. The scene was treated with meticulous care as detectives combed through the surroundings for any clues that might shed light on the young woman's identity and the circumstances of her death. Forensic teams worked diligently, collecting evidence and documenting every detail. Despite their efforts, the lack of identification on the body complicated the process. The initial investigation revealed that the young woman had likely been dead for less than 24 hours. Bruises and marks on her body suggested she had met a violent end. The police began a thorough search of missing person reports, hoping to find a match that would help them identify the victim. The following day, April 4, 2011, Robert Frisbee walked into the police station, his face etched with worry. He reported his 17-year-old daughter, Bridget, as missing. Robert explained that Bridget had supposedly spent the previous night at a friend's house, but had not returned home and was not answering her phone. His mounting concern had turned to fear, prompting him to seek help. The police, aware of the unidentified body found the day before, immediately recognized the potential connection. They asked Robert to provide a detailed description of Bridget and any recent photographs. With a sinking feeling, Robert complied, describing his daughter's appearance and distinctive features. A few hours later, Robert received a call from the police asking him to come to the morgue. The authorities needed him to identify the body found in the woods. Shaken and praying for a different outcome, Robert arrived at the morgue accompanied by a detective. When the sheet was pulled back, revealing the face of the young woman, Robert's world shattered. His worst fears were confirmed. The body was indeed his beloved daughter, Bridget. The emotional trauma of identifying his only child was overwhelming. Robert was inconsolable, devastated by the loss and the brutal reality of Bridget's fate. The discovery and subsequent identification of Bridget's body marked the beginning of a harrowing journey for Robert, as he grappled with grief while the police intensified their efforts to uncover the truth behind her tragic death. The last day of Bridget Frisbee's life, April 2, 2011, began like any other Saturday. Bridget, known for her vibrant personality and love for music, was excited to attend a rave that evening. She had spent the afternoon meticulously selecting her outfit, a colorful ensemble of neon hues, complete with glow-in-the-dark accessories. Her best friend, Kendall Pseudo, arrived around 6 p.m. to pick her up. The two had planned a fun night out, starting with the rave and ending with a movie night at Kendall's house. Robert Frisbee remembered the events of April 2nd with haunting clarity. Bridget had been in high spirits, chatting animatedly about the upcoming rave. She had hugged him tightly before leaving, promising to call if there were any changes in her plans. As the evening turned into night, Robert received a text from Bridget around 10 p.m. saying she was having a great time and would be home by noon the next day after spending the night at Kendall's. That was the last communication he received from his daughter. The following day, April 3rd, Robert expected Bridget to return by noon as promised. However, noon came and went with no sign of her. He called Kendall, who said Bridget had left the rave around midnight with another friend but never returned to her house. Panic set in as Robert tried reaching Bridget's other friends, but no one had seen or heard from her since the rave. Fearing the worst, he spent the rest of the day calling hospitals and police stations, hoping for any news. The police began their investigation by interviewing Kendall Pseudo, the last person known to have seen Bridget. Kendall recounted the events of the rave, describing how Bridget had left with another friend, Jonathan Larson, her ex-boyfriend. Although Kendall was cooperative, inconsistencies in her story made her the initial suspect. Detectives questioned her repeatedly, probing for any hidden motives or connections to the crime. However, Kendall's alibi checked out, and she was eventually cleared of suspicion. Attention then turned to Jonathan Larson, Bridget's ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had ended tumultuously a few months prior, with heated arguments and lingering resentment. Jonathan admitted to leaving the rave with Bridget, but claimed they had parted ways soon after, as she had decided to walk home alone. His history of volatile behavior made him a prime suspect, but without concrete evidence linking him to the crime, the police couldn't hold him. The investigation then zeroed in on Zach Richards, Bridget's current boyfriend. Zach and Bridget had been dating for several months, and by all accounts, their relationship was healthy and happy. However, in the days leading up to Bridget's disappearance, friends reported seeing tensions between them. Zach was brought in for questioning, and although he seemed genuinely distraught over Bridget's death, inconsistencies in his alibi raised red flags. He claimed to have been home all night, but neighbors reported hearing raised voices and a commotion from his house late that evening. As the investigation continued, the police struggled to piece together the events leading up to Bridget's death. Each suspect presented a plausible motive, but the lack of physical evidence complicated the case. The tragic loss of Bridget Frisbee weighed heavily on the small Texas community, leaving them desperate for answers and justice for the young woman whose life was cut tragically short. According to the detectives, Kendall Pseudo was the first person to undergo a comprehensive interview. She confirmed that Bridget had left the rave with Jonathan Larson, her ex-boyfriend, as she detailed the events that had transpired since the previous evening. The alibi that Kendall presented was a strong one. She had spent the entire night with other friends and had come home in the early morning hours. Her narrative was supported by a number of witnesses who confirmed her explanation. Her account remained constant, and the police eventually disregarded her as a suspect, despite the fact that they had initially suspected her of being involved. The detectives then shifted their attention to Jonathan Larson as the next target. When they got at his house, they discovered that it had been abandoned in a spooky manner. Within the building, the walls were peppered with gunshot holes, and the front entrance was slightly ajar. The furniture was flipped over, and there were indications that there had been a battle. There was no indication of Larson, but there was blood splatter, which indicated that there had been a serious assault. As a result of this discovery, the investigation became more urgent, and Jonathan Larson was immediately identified as the primary suspect in both the murder of Bridget and what appeared to be a linked violent incident that took place at his residence. As a result of Larson's disappearance and the fact that there was evidence of a violent altercation at his residence, the detectives continued their investigation. Additionally, they conducted interviews with Bridget's classmates and friends in the hope of obtaining any additional leads. Alexander Olivieri and Alan Perez were two names that came to light during the course of these interviews which were conducted. The two individuals had been observed with Jonathan Larson on the night of the rave, and they were both familiar with his affiliation with the party. In order to question them, the police made the decision to bring them in. Both Alexander Olivieri and Alan Perez were brought in for separate interrogations upon their arrival. Olivieri evaded questions, provided relatively little information, and frequently contradicted his own statements. His alibi was not able to withstand the examination that was conducted on it, despite the fact that he claimed to have been at home throughout the time that Bridget went missing. On the other hand, Perez gave off an impression of being anxious and tense. His answers were ambiguous, and he appeared eager to get out of the police station as soon as possible. When the detectives realized that Perez was concealing something of great importance, they made the decision to continue to question him. Following a number of hours of rigorous questioning, Alan Perez eventually lost his composure. Having come to the realization that his predicament was extremely serious, he made an offer to provide vital information in exchange for being exempt from prosecution. Under the premise that his knowledge would lead to significant advancements in the investigation, the detectives readily agreed to his requirements. They were eager to make a breakthrough in the investigation. Bridget's death was proven to have a shocking relation to the drive-by shooting that took place at the residence of Jonathan Larson, as disclosed by Perez. He admitted that the walls that were covered in gunshot holes were the result of a fight that was tied to gangs. The fact that Jonathan Larson had become connected with a local gang had contributed to the escalation of tensions between competing factions. When Larson returned home from the rave, he was confronted by members of the gang who had followed him there. This confrontation led to the violent firefight that took place. After that, Perez suggested that Alexander Olivieri was personally responsible for Bridget's passing. Larson and Olivieri had traveled to an isolated spot to address a gang-related subject, according to his evidence. This occurred after Larson and Olivieri had left the rave with Bridget. In a fit of rage, Olivieri struck Bridget because he was afraid that she would reveal their actions. The discussion had become violent. Bridget was then left at the mercy of Olivieri after Larson, who was unable to maintain control of the situation, departed. According to the comprehensive accounts that were offered by Perez, who had been aware of this plan but was not personally participating in the murder, the evidence that was discovered at the crime site was consistent with the story. Through the evidence of Perez, the detectives were able to piece together the tragic chain of events that resulted in the premature death of Bridget Frisbee. Because of this breakthrough, they were able to redirect their efforts toward catching Alexander Olivieri and bringing him to court. The investigation, which now has a more complete picture, has come one step closer to being resolved, providing a glimmer of hope to the mourning family of Bridget as well as the community as a whole. Immediately following the confession made by Alan Perez, the investigators refocused their attention on Zach Richards, who is currently Bridget's boyfriend, in an effort to gather any further information that would help them strengthen their case. Zach was utterly heartbroken by Bridget's passing, and he had cooperatively participated in the investigation throughout its entirety. It was on the evening of April 2nd, just before she departed for the party, that he saw Bridget for the final time. He related this story in the interview that he gave. It was confirmed by him that Bridget had been enthusiastic about the occasion and that she had no plans to meet up with anyone other than her friends. For the purpose of creating a clear timeline of Bridget's last known movements, Zach's statement was extremely important. He claimed that he had received a text message from Bridget at midnight in which she stated that she was having a good time and would most likely arrive home late. The statements made by Kendall Sudo were supported by this timeline, which also demonstrated that Bridget was in the company of Jonathan Larson and Alexander Olivieri around the time that she was last seen alive. Zach also claimed that Bridget had voiced her concerns regarding Larson's involvement with questionable persons, but she had not mentioned that she felt directly endangered by Larson's actions. This evidence helped corroborate that Bridget's contact with Olivieri and Larson was not planned and was most likely an opportunistic one. It also gave insight on the tumultuous events that followed. Alexander Olivieri was placed under custody after police obtained a warrant for his arrest based on solid evidence and the testimony of Perez. As a result of Olivieri's history of violent behavior and the possibility that he has connections to local gangs, it was decided to enlist a SWAT squad in order to guarantee a secure and well-managed arrest. The Special Weapons and Tactics team arrived at Olivieri's apartment in the wee hours of the morning on April 10th. Olivieri was taken aback by the rapid and accurate implementation of the operation, which resulted in his capture without any complications. After Olivieri was taken into custody, a comprehensive search of his residence as well as his vehicle was carried out. Within his residence, the police discovered garments that had been stained with blood and that matched the description of what Bridget was wearing on the night that she vanished. In addition, they found a small stash of illegal substances as well as several firearms that were not registered, which further implicates Olivieri in carrying out unlawful operations. Traces of blood and hair were discovered in his vehicle by the detectives, and after a forensic test, they were proven to be identical to Bridget's DNA. In order to establish a direct connection between Olivieri and the crime scene and the murder of Bridget, this tangible evidence was essential. The evidence that was gathered from Olivieri's house and automobile, in conjunction with the thorough testimony that was provided by Perez and the timeline that was established, brought about a convincing case against Olivieri. The indisputable proof of his involvement was presented by the forensic evidence, which included the clothing that was stained with blood and similar DNA matches. Furthermore, the discovery of gang-related items and illicit weapons brought to light the perilous environment in which Olivieri operated, hence highlighting the tragic outcome that befell Bridget Frisbee. The arrest of Olivieri was a crucial milestone in the investigation, and it brought a sense of justice to the community as well as to the family of Bridget. As a result of the meticulous work of the detectives and the bravery of witnesses such as Alan Perez, it was ensured that those responsible for Bridget's death would be subjected to the full force of the law. The attention shifted to achieving a conviction that would bring some relief to those who were affected by this horrible event as the judicial proceedings got underway. The 5th of October 2011 marked the beginning of the trial of Alexander Olivieri, who was accused of killing Bridget Frisbee. Everyone who had been following the tragic case attentively, including members of the media, family members, and community supporters, was crammed into the courtroom. To build a horrifying picture of the circumstances that led up to Bridget's death, the prosecution painstakingly detailed the timeline as well as the evidence that was presented against Olivieri. As a result of his engagement in gang operations and drug trafficking, they argued that he was responsible for the savage murder of Bridget Frisbee. They presented him as a heartless guy who had a history of aggressive behavior. The defense, on the other hand, made an effort to cast doubt on the evidence as well as the credibility of witnesses, particularly Alan Perez. According to their argument, Perez may have falsified or exaggerated certain aspects in order to save himself when he was attempting to obtain immunity. A further suggestion that was made was that the evidence that was discovered in Olivieri's house and automobile might have been fabricated or misread, and they urged the jury to take into consideration the likelihood of reasonable doubt. For the purpose of bolstering its case, the prosecution produced a persuasive assortment of evidence. The credit card statement that Bridget had, which showed the transactions that put her in contact with Olivieri on the evening of April 2nd, was an important piece of evidence. In addition, forensic specialists stated that fibers discovered on Bridget's clothing were identical to the upholstery found in Olivieri's vehicle, which establishes an additional connection between Olivieri and the crime scene. An online video that was uploaded to YouTube on the same night that the party took place was one of the most damaging pieces of evidence. An individual who was present at the event took a video that confirmed the existence of Olivieri and Larson together on that particular evening. Bridget was seen in the backdrop of the video. As a result of this visual evidence, the defense was dealt a huge blow because it contradicted their assertions and established Olivieri's connection to Bridget. The evidence of Alan Perez was a defining event in the proceedings of the trial. In horrifying detail, he related the circumstances that led up to Bridget's murder. He described how Olivieri had become agitated during an argument and then struck her, causing her death. Perez's testimony was in line with the findings of the forensic investigation and the fact that he was ready to testify despite the potential danger to himself gave his statements more credibility. As a result of his courageous decision to come forward, the prosecution stressed the significant role that Perez had in bringing the truth to light. Following several weeks of consideration and testimony, the jury came to the conclusion that Alexander Olivieri was responsible for the death of Bridget Frisbie. Olivieri was given a sentence of 60 years in jail without the chance of parole on the 12th of December in 2011. His actions were deemed horrible and senseless by the judge, who expressed the hope that the sentence would serve as a deterrence to others who were involved in illegal activities that were comparable to those that he had committed. Immediately following the conclusion of the trial, Robert Frisbie gave a speech to the community as well as the media. He expressed his gratitude to the law enforcement authorities, attorneys, and witnesses who had worked relentlessly to ensure that his daughter received justice. His expression was a mixture of sadness and relief. He talked about the enormous vacuum that Bridget's absence had left in their lives, as well as the strong energy that she possessed. As another point of emphasis, Robert emphasized the significance of the verdict in conveying a powerful message against acts of violence and criminality. His intention was that Olivieri's sentence would not only serve as a punishment, but also as a warning to anyone who might be considering engaging in crimes that are comparable to those that Olivieri had committed. With an eye toward the future, Robert Frisbie made a commitment to remember Bridget's memory by fighting for more robust community programs that attempt to prevent young people from becoming involved in gangs and to promote increased safety. As a result of the case's completion, those individuals who had been severely impacted by Bridget's untimely death were able to experience some degree of closure. The justice that was obtained in the trial laid the groundwork for healing and was a step toward a future in which such senseless acts of violence may be stopped. Despite the fact that the agony of her loss would never completely go away, the basis for healing was laid. Thank you for watching. I recommend our other crime videos.